I am an arborist. It's a career that has lasted generations throughout my family. It began with my great-grandfather, a man named Ernest Tosh. From what I've learned, Ernest was once a lively, passionate man. His love of trees had started from a young age, and he devoted his life to the growing, selling, and caring of trees. He eventually married and had a son, my grandfather. Ernest taught my grandfather everything he knew, from species identification to the proper care and maintaining of trees. Then, one day, Ernest had completely changed, almost out of the blue. He became quiet and reclusive, disappearing from home for hours at a time. One morning he left. Hours went by, yet he never returned home. He was never seen again. My grandfather grew up and continued his father's legacy. Eventually, he married and had a son of his own. He taught my father, who ended up teaching me. My father and I lived in a secluded farmhouse, far from neighbors and nearby towns. This was the same house my great-grandfather lived in, passed down throughout the ages. My mother died during childbirth. The loss of his wife was tragic, yet my father never lost his spirit. He named me Magnolia, after my mother's favorite tree. After my birth, he planted one as well, to honor both me and my mother. It was beautiful, with fragrant pink and white flowers. Out of the many trees in our expensive yard, it was the most beautiful. Our property had many trees, from small flowering trees to tall shade trees. Each and every one of them was beautiful and unique in its own way. I was a little girl, only 8 years old, when my father found the seed. He was inside looking through boxes of old things when he found a small, decorative box. He opened it, finding a single seed, knowing that I was already developing an interest in trees. My father called me over to see it. It was unlike any seed we'd ever seen before. It was small, around the size of an acorn, and a deep shade of red. It was squishy and oddly shaped. Being completely new to the both of us, we decided to plant it as an experiment. He took out a small pot, filled it with soil, and planted the seed in a shallow hole. Surprisingly, the seed didn't take long to germinate at all. It only took a few days for it to break the soil. What emerged from the soil was bizarre. It was a tiny stem, a pale shade of tan, that was soft and smooth to the touch. The feeling of the stem was familiar, yet we couldn't identify why at the time. Even stranger were the small cluster of leaves atop the stem. They were jet black, stringy, and hair-like. My father was in awe. He consulted every tree identification guide he had, yet none of them contained any information about this strange tree. He assumed it was some sort of undiscovered variant of the weeping willow, due to its odd, hair-like leaves. However, the seed did not resemble a willow seed at all. Only time would tell. The tree grew shockingly fast. In only a few weeks, it resembled less of a seedling and more of a tiny tree. Its stem had grown taller and slightly wider, and it has grown more hair-like leaves. Both me and my father were fascinated by this bizarre tree and planted it near the magnolia tree. That was our first mistake. As the tree got older, its stem changed as well. It was still pale and tan, yet it now had various tiny spots and tiny patterns of barely visible lines. My father touched the stem, still soft yet strangely flaky now. "Why does this feel so familiar?" my father mumbled to himself. As he continued to analyze the small tree, he scratched his arm for a moment. He suddenly paused, eyes wide. "What's wrong, Dad?" I asked him. He was quiet for a moment. He felt his arm again and looked at me. The stem feels like skin." I touched the stem, then touched my arm. My father was right. The stem did feel almost identical to the feeling of human skin. The dots and pale lines on the stem matched the appearance of flaky skin with scattered freckles. My father told me to stay put as he headed towards our shed. He returned with a tiny knife. He made a small and precise incision on the stem, making sure to only lightly cut into the second layer of the stem. He gasped, recoiling back. The tree was bleeding. Without a doubt, the small amount of fluid dripping from the cut resembled both the appearance and metallic smell of human blood. But as quickly as the cut was made, it somehow rapidly healed. Only seconds after it was cut, the wound disappeared. My father was shocked, yet intrigued. This was unlike anything he had ever seen before, and no matter how strange it looked, he was determined to grow this tree and figure out more. Over the next 5 years, the tree grew rapidly. By the time it was 5 years old, it was a little over 6 feet tall, slightly taller than my father. The trunk had grown wider, still resembling the appearance and feel of human skin. The black leaves of the tree were in fact identical to strands of human hair, and dropped down the branches like a willow's leaves. Even stranger, as the seasons went by, the tree never lost its leaves. I was 13 years old when the tree produced its first fruit. The tree was currently 5 years old. My father and I did our routine check of the tree. Amongst the hairy leaves, we discovered what appeared to be small, fleshy orbs clinging to the branches. The orbs were transparent and appeared to have a small, cloudy shape inside. It was strange, since fruit production typically occurred in trees at an older age. Even stranger, before trees produce their fruit, they produce flowers. The tree apparently skipped the flowering stage completely. As days went by, the orbs began to change in appearance. They grew larger and eventually stopped growing. However, the shape inside the orb never stopped growing. The day the orbs broke, my father screamed. I woke up to the sound of a shocked scream. I ran downstairs, went outside, and saw my father standing in front of the tree. When I saw it, I screamed as well. The orbs turned out to be embryos, and what remained, dangling from the branches, were tiny, human babies. At least they heavily resembled human babies. They were naked and fleshy, coming in all kinds of skin tones. However, they had no hair, no genitals, and no faces. They were human-shaped lumps of flesh and skin. My father panicked. He once again told me to stay put and headed towards the shed. He returned with an axe. He didn't know whether it was fear or just pure shock that made him do it, but he somehow knew that this tree was dangerous and needed to be cut down. With a swift swing, he expected the tree to fall down, but it didn't. He tried again and again. Every time his axe cut the tree, the wound healed before it could even fall down. My father and I stared at one another. The tree appeared to be invincible. He had no choice but to let it grow. Every day, the fleshy human forms that dangled from the tree grew larger. Within a week, they resembled fully sized human bodies. Like all fruits do, they eventually fell. My father was reluctant, but he knew what he had to do. We walked over to one of the fallen bodies, a knife in my father's hand. He made the incision, a large gash, against the body's torso. He opened it up, and we both gagged as the smell of ripened flesh and blood hit our noses. The entire inside of the body was one hollow cavity, the walls fleshy and red like a human's body. However, inside the fleshy cavity were thousands of those small red, squishy seeds. We burned the bodies, every single one that fell from the tree. For days, the only thing we could smell, inside and outside of the house, was burning flesh. Once you smell it, the scent can never truly leave your mind. Thankfully, after a few weeks, the tree's fruiting period ended. However, we did notice something else that we had somehow missed. Maybe we were too distracted by the tree's fruit to notice it. The grass beneath the tree was a dry, brittle yellow. The patch surrounded the tree and spread to the magnolia tree next to it. The magnolia was dying. We did everything we could to save it. We tried digging it up, yet the roots were already deteriorating. It couldn't be saved at this point. We watched as our precious magnolia tree shriveled and our new tree thrived. At that point, my dad gave up. The tree was uncuttable, and the patch of dead grass continued to spread. If we stayed on this property, the new tree would continue to steal the resources that other trees needed. We packed up all of our belongings and began the moving process. We eventually settled in a house in the nearest town. It was drastically different, surrounded by neighbors and close to all the stores we needed to go to. It took time getting used to, but we adapted. My dad got an arborist position for our new town. Much of his work revolved around coordinating decorative tree growing and planting around the town. I continued school, graduated from college, and eventually got my own job as an arborist. Though I had moved out when I was 22, my father and I remained close. Things were going steady for the both of us. It's been 20 years since we planted that seed. I was now 28, living alone, and saving for a house of my own. It was early in the morning. I was still in bed when I got a phone call. It was from my father. Groggy from sleep, I picked up the phone and answered it. "Hello?" "Magnolia," he began. "This is going to sound crazy, but we need to go back to the old house. I'm heading over to your place now. There's something you need to see." He spoke quickly and sounded anxious. I got up, got dressed, and waited for him to come. Finally, I saw his car arrive. He ushered me inside and showed me something. It was the tiny decorative box that we had found the seed in. "I was digging around through some old stuff," he began, "and I found the old box with the seed inside. I was fiddling around with it and found this." He pulled at the side of the box, a small panel opening up and revealing a hidden compartment. Inside of the compartment was a small folded piece of paper. He opened it, revealing a poem. "Another world I found this in, a world of darkness, fear, and sin. The sky was gray, devoid of light, no stars to brighten up the night. The bodies hung from branches bound, they swinged and plummet to the ground. In front of me a tall tree stood, a tree with bark of skin, not wood. The tree of flesh is what it's called. It can't be cut down, burned, or mauled. An endless growth and endless rain. The tree will make, the tree will gain. But all things end as all things start. The key to death is through its heart." E.T. My father stared at me, the expression on his face completely genuine. "Once I found and read this things started to make sense. Your great-grandfather wrote this and likely disappeared soon after. He paused, then looked at me again. I think he found that seed in another dimension. If it were anyone else saying this or any other situation, I would have laughed. But I completely believed the words my father was saying. This tree is no known species on Earth. The appearance, fruit, and seeds of the tree were so horribly bizarre that it would only make sense that they weren't from our world. This would always be something we wouldn't truly know, but it completely made sense in Ernest Hash's disappearance. He likely died in this other world, my father continued. It explains how he could have disappeared without a trace. I noticed something in the back seat of the car. My dad had brought various tools and shovels. Dad, what are those for? I asked him. As I read the poem, he began, I had a realization. I think the heart of the tree is the seed itself. But that's impossible, I said. The tree's matured and developed a root system. The original seed is likely gone by now. But what if it isn't a seed? My father said. What if it really is a living, growing heart? I thought about it. I guess we would find out. The drive lasted about an hour before we arrived at our old property. Surprisingly, for being abandoned for 15 years, the house did not look terrible. Though its paint was chipping and some roof shingles had fallen off, the house was still intact. However, the grass around the entire property was dry, brittle, and yellow. Not a single tree on our property was alive. Fallen trunks and tree stumps were the only reminder that they existed in the first place. Slightly from behind the house, we could see the black, hairy leaves of the tree. We grabbed our shovels, exited the car, and headed towards the backyard. And there it was. The tree was now taller than the house itself. Its trunk was huge, and its hairy leaves drooped down from its many branches. Many fleshy, skin-covered bodies were dangling from the tree. Others littered the ground, burst open from the fall, with their seeds spilling out. Surrounding the tree were many seedlings. Thankfully, they couldn't compete with the resources of the biggest tree and did not grow much at all. My father and I grabbed our shovels and began to dig. Underneath the soil were the large red vein-like roots of the tree. We dug and dug for what felt like hours before we finally found it. There, beneath the soil and connected to all the veins, was a giant beating heart. Little had we known that beneath the tree, that tiny little seed would grow into this. My father grabbed the biggest, sharpest shovel he had brought. We both held onto it and drove it directly into the heart. We stabbed it again and again, blood squirting out and covering our faces and clothes. It took a long time before the giant, mangled heart finally died. As fast as the tree could heal itself, the tree died. It started with the heart. It lost its color, turned a sickly shade of gray, and completely disintegrated. The veiny roots followed suit, and eventually, the towering tree itself. It collapsed in on itself, the tree falling to the ground as the trunk began to disintegrate from the bottom. Eventually, the entire tree had disintegrated, leaving only gray ash and the fallen bodies as a reminder of its existence. We easily killed the remaining seedlings and crushed their tiny hearts. We burned the remaining bodies, smelling the sickly stench of burning flesh one last time. My father pulled me in for a hug as we stared at our old home. The tree was finally gone. With our remaining money, my father and I decided to move back into the old house. There were many repairs to do, but we managed to bring the house back to its former glory. It took time, but without the tree to steal its resources, the grass managed to regrow by the next spring. We planted many trees back onto our property. They too would take time to grow, but it made the process all the more enjoyable. My father and I became a team. We turned our property into a family-run tree farm and nursery, working together to grow and sell trees. One day, my father called me over. He was hiding something behind his back. "When the old magnolia died," he began, "I collected as many seeds as I could and stored them in a box. As long as they're kept in a cool, dark place, they could last years." He paused for a moment, then continued. "A few months ago, I put the seeds through a period of cold stratifying so they could germinate. None of them were viable." He brought his arms forward, a small pot in his hands. Inside the pot, peeking out from the dirt, was a tiny magnolia sapling. A warm smile grew on both of our faces. Except one.
Hello everyone, Grim here, and thank you all for making it to the end. Today's story was incredibly narrated by the amazing Phoenix Fire, or as some of you know him, probably most, Back to Ashes. This story was titled The Tree of Flesh, written by ActualGuyFieri. I am sorry that I didn't upload last week. I had a pretty bad bike accident, left my face a little bit munted, so to speak. My cheek and jaw are still under recovery, so long talking is a little bit more painful than normal. So thankfully I had my best friend in horror narrate the story for me. I do hope that you enjoyed his narration, and I know he enjoyed, as always, going through and narrating this. So I'm not going to drag this out, as I didn't really add much to it, but I just want to let all of you know that you are important, you're kind, you're here for a purpose, and whatever you feel you're going through, I know you're strong enough to get through it. I don't know why I'm so sentimental. I think it's because of the medication they've put me on to get me through it all. But anyway, thank you all for listening, and as always, I am Grim, and I'm, well, signing off.